So you have the panel here already?
Yes, they're both here, Professor Toft and Ms. Ponde.
Nice to meet you guys.
Yes, can you see us?
Yeah.
Can you see us?
I can see, I'm sort of having a very small screen called the ASEAN Auditorium screen. So I can see you guys somewhere far in the distance. Kind of thing.
Is that the camera there? Yes. Okay.
I think it's just it's probably just the type of screen that was set up at the beginning. So maybe when you're speaking, maybe I can get a closer view of who's speaking. That'd be great. You can zoom in on the speakers.
You have the slides, right? Yeah. Here, I'll get the demo. Oh, yes.
Is my volume okay? Are you hearing me okay?
Yes, you sound good.
Very good, thank you.
Professor Knight, is that view of the speakers better for you?
Sorry, the speaker?
Is the view
I didn't
of the
hear that
speakers better for you? I zoomed in.
Sorry, I was missing a word here. You saying that something's better for me?
I'm asking, is the view of the speakers better for
Oh,
you?
the speaker. It's the same, really. I can see there's three people on the panel.
Okay,
And you're quite a distance away, so I
Yeah.
can't see you very clearly.
okay.
So I don't know if there's a way of sort of zooming in on the speaker, and then whichever one's speaking, to have it zoomed in onto that person. I can see them better. But that's okay. I can, as long as I can hear you, that's the main important thing, I think.
Okay, great. Okay, what was that? All right, well, thank you everyone. I think we're going to begin now. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at 10 o'clock a.m. on a Saturday. We really appreciate it. This is our third and final day of our panel discussion for the 2023 EPIIC Symposium on Race and International Relations. My name is Paloma Delgado. I'm a senior at Tufts studying international relations, and I will be moderating our first panel for today. So this panel discussion will center on race, war, and humanitarian intervention. Across the world, we are seeing countless countries experiencing war, conflict, and ongoing and developing crises, some receiving more attention than others. Whether it's the war in Ukraine, which began just over a year ago, the ongoing civil war in Myanmar, which has reached its 2-year anniversary, or war in countries like Syria and Yemen, which began over a decade and nearly a decade ago, respectively. International conflict has been widespread and has had devastating consequences. Racialization and the role that race plays in not only producing conflict, but also in shaping responses to conflict is frequently overlooked. White supremacy, neocolonialist ideologies, and institutionalized racism continue to inform efforts of intervention that are destructive, as well as inaction in areas of the world that are frequently overlooked. Racism and the lack of attention it receives feeds existing power imbalances between the global north and global south, failing to address the needs of those on the ground. I'm delighted to be joined today by this incredible panel to help us better understand and contend with the issues of race, wars, and humanitarian intervention, and discuss potential solutions and ideas for implementing a more sustainable, productive, and anti-racist response to global conflicts. I want to begin by introducing Savita Pandey. Ms. Pandey is the Executive Director of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, the world's leading research and advocacy organization for advancing the international norm of the responsibility to protect, or R2P, which works to prevent mass atrocities on a global scale. Ms. Pandey is an expert on R2P and atrocity prevention and has worked extensively with numerous governments and the United Nations on how to prevent and respond to mass atrocities. Ms. Pandey has led the Global Center's work on UN peacekeeping, international justice mechanisms, women, peace and security, and advocacy on specific country situations where populations are at risk of atrocities. Welcome, Ms. Pandey. Our next speaker, who is joining us from Zoom, is Professor Andy Knight. Professor Knight is the inaugural Provost Fellow in Black Excellence and Leadership at the University of Alberta, a Professor of International Relations in the Department of Political Science, and a University of Alberta Distinguished Professor. Professor Knight was recently awarded a grant by the Canadian Department of Defence to assess the extent to which white supremacy is entrenched within Canada's military, and was one of 16 Commonwealth Observer Group members selected for Nigeria's general elections in February, so he just returned from Abuja this morning. Professor Knight is also currently the 2021-2022 Fulbright Distinguished Chair in International and Area Studies at Yale University. Welcome, Professor Knight.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And our final speaker is Professor Monica Toft. Professor Toft is a professor of international politics and director of the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Prior to joining Fletcher, Professor Toft taught at Oxford University's Blavatnik School of Government and Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and also spent 4 years in the United States Army as a Russian linguist. Professor Toft is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and a global scholar at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. Welcome, Professor Toft. All right, so now we will transition into the presentations from each panelist. They'll provide a little bit of expertise and background before we move into discussion questions and questions from the audience. So I will have Professor Toft start us off with her presentation.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here on this lovely Saturday morning in winter time. Looks like we're getting some more sleet, rain, perhaps some snow, we'll see. So I'm here this morning. I'm going to sort of provide an overview at about 30,000 feet. I just finished a major research project at the Fletcher School at my center. Many students helped with this, including undergrads, so your compatriots. And it was a 5-year project. And what we were trying to do was investigate the degree to which the United States intervenes in other states since 1776, since the founding of the country. I had started this project. I'm a student of civil wars. It's pretty much where my bailiwick is, also of religion, identity, race. My first book, my dissertation, was looking at identity politics and the conditions under which different identity groups came into conflict with one another. And I was troubled because in many of these conflicts, when there were outside interventions, a number of these wars, they tended to be civil wars, but sometimes interstate wars, when outside interveners got involved, it dragged on. And that makes sense. You think about it intuitively, right? You're bringing more personnel, more resources, more direction into that war. So I was curious about the role of the United States. I'm a US Army veteran. I'm proud of my service, but I'm nervous about the United States and its militarization. And so I wanted to sort of contribute not only academically in terms of research, but in terms of policy circles. And I will say that the research is having an impact at the highest levels in the US government in terms of our decision to get out of Afghanistan. Whether you think that was a good decision or not, it was inevitable. It was going to be messy. How it was done was not well, but I think in some ways it needed to be done, and the question is what do we do about it now? So I'm going to run through the data, and this is not working. So do we have a keyboard that I can work on to advance slides? Pardon? Is there one in the door? Perfect, we're good. I'm going to talk just briefly about why the U.S. failed in Afghanistan and how this failure was part of a broader pattern in U.S. foreign policy. And in your own personal life, and I think your professional lives, there's a theme here, which is about humility and hubris. And you need to have a balance of that, and I think the United States has been on the hubristic side. You need a little bit of humility as well, and you do need a little bit of hubris, but I think the United States needs to learn lessons that it was too hubristic for a period. And then what this means in terms of diplomacy, peace, security, and particularly for women, because I know with Afghanistan when we were trying to pull back, the big concern was human rights for women. I think one of our panelists may get into some of those issues. We'll see. So why did the U.S. fail in Afghanistan? What's really interesting about that question is that when the U.S. does its analysis, and actually when other foreign governments or Western allies who got involved, they're not allowed to ask that question. So when Sigger, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, investigates Afghanistan, the question is not why did the U.S. fail, but why did the Afghanistan government collapse? Think about that, right? It's a much different question than if you ask, what did the United States itself do wrong? Again, there's that arrogance. We did nothing wrong. We set up a perfect environment for the Afghans, right? The lowly Afghans to succeed, and they just couldn't do it. Rather than looking at our role in it to say, what is it that we failed to do in order to help that nation? And so our project, I'm on a new project now, aside from this military intervention project, where we're investigating those very hard assumptions that people in the US government cannot ask. There is a congressional commission looking at what happened in failure in Afghanistan, but they're not allowed to ask that question. They're allowed to ask the immediate question about why the pullout was so bad and devastating, right, which it was militarily, strategically, why it wasn't better planned. We knew it was going to happen. European allies are doing similar kinds of investigations about how they could have lost so many resources and personnel, and also led to the destruction of, in some ways, of Afghan society and resources. But they can't ask this question, why did Norway fail? Why did the UK fail? Why did France fail? Why did Germany fail? Why did Italy fail? The 42 partners who joined us in that. So really critical. So I think there's 4 reasons for the failure. One is ignorance. We think we know better, right? The powerful always think they knew better. And there's no clear sense of the country. And in fact, when we went into Afghanistan, there wasn't anybody in the State Department who knew anything about Afghanistan, right? Think about that. So there's history and the culture, which is one of the reasons why when you look at when the United States, after 9/11, it was the CIA, and there was pretty much one operative, Stephen Grenier, who ended up becoming the lead because he had spent time there helping to defeat or helping to fight with the Northern Alliance. So first is ignorance. Second is what I'm concerned about is this hyper-militarization of U.S. foreign policy, which is a force-first mission. And I know we're going to hear about responsibility to protect, and hopefully you get into some of the issues about that, which is that impulse, we've got to use force. Well, there are other tools in the toolbox, right? And in fact, if you have much longer time horizons, force should never be on the table, right? Just war theory says it should be a last resort, and R2P is premised on just war theory, but we tend to use it as a knee-jerk reaction. And then once we get involved, we tend to escalate our objectives. It's not enough to go in and rout out the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, right? Now we have to think about longer term and nation building. And it turns out regime change is extraordinarily difficult, and we have really hardcore data and evidence that shows that it's nearly impossible. It has to come indigenously. The population has to do it. Now we can help, right? We can give aid to help with that. But regime change is very difficult because leaders don't want to give up power. Look at Putin today, right? Putin does not, because he understands his life as he knows it is going to be over. And then nation building is even more difficult because nation building is premised on knowing the history, the culture, the desires and wants of the other side. And we're sort of deaf to that. And then last, you have to have your neighbor's support. It's not usually just a domestic within state situation. Usually there's a regional dynamic, and given great power politics or regional politics, if you have medium powers, they're going to pick and choose what they want to do and intervene on their own. And you have to sort of manage that. So again, returning to Afghanistan, understanding Pakistan's interests. We didn't care. We just basically told Musharraf, President Musharraf, that we want to go in, we're going in, no choice. Without thinking about Pakistan's interests, the fact that they have an indigenous Islamic fundamentalist group that has extremist views about what it means to be a Muslim, and him fearing himself for his power. Now we can talk about whether Musharraf's a good president and all that, but the point is that Pakistan had its own interests. We didn't care. We overrode them. And I do think there's a racist element to that, by the way. And then lack of learning. We don't update. Like I said, the data were really clear before the United States went into Afghanistan that these are very, very difficult fights and very difficult interventions. The Soviet Union couldn't succeed. Thermonuclear power, right on the border with it. The United States had failed in Vietnam. Right there, we had done that just decades earlier. And on and on. You can think about the French in Algeria, the French in Vietnam. These are very difficult operations. And then that last bit, that balancing, that hubris over humility, I think this is sort of a big, part of a broader issue with great powers, major powers, but even medium powers, that they're too hubristic and not stepping back and saying, what is it that I know? What is it that I don't know? Oh, and by the way, can I talk to the other side to get some of that information? So just to give you a quick overview of the data summary on this, U.S. has intervened close to 400 times since the founding of the country. Now, some of these interventions are fabulous, right? We're saving lives. But the bulk, the worrisome is that the bulk of them, the more modern contemporary era, are not for humanitarian issues. It's for advancing U.S. interests without really thinking about what's going on the ground. So if you look at the more contemporary period, the U.S. intervened more than 25%, more than a quarter of the interventions have taken place in the post-Cold War era. Think about that. This was a time when the United States is a unipolar power, basically. The Soviet Union's gone. China has not risen yet. And the United States isn't now. Some of them were for good reasons. We tried our best in Somalia, failed, mission creep, right? But that meant that we didn't get involved in Rwanda because we thought we're not going to do another African intervention. Right? So we've really got to be very discerning about when it went in and when it didn't go in. And some people make the case, a number of scholars, Samantha Power probably most forcefully, that we could have intervened in that case, and we should have, and we could have made a positive difference. Rather than, by the way, an estimated 500,000 to 1 million dead. And that probably even underestimates it because we don't get the indirect deaths as a result of that genocide. And then we've had 72 interventions since the end of 2000, and we've been really heavily involved in the Middle East and North Africa region more recently. And in part, the reason for that is the global war on terror, which we're trying to now de-escalate because, of course, China's rising. So if you look at U.S. interventions by era, and here you're looking from 1776 across to 2017, what you want to notice is that one all the way to the right, 2001 to 2017, we're now an equal opportunity global intervener. So what I mean by that is that there's no place on earth that the United States is not happy to go in and try to rectify a situation. Perhaps for good, or perhaps for advancing U.S. national interests. I'm not saying that intervention is bad under all circumstances. Look, I was a former U.S. Army soldier. I believe that you have moments where you have to use force. I think Putin's evil. I think we have to do something about that. Whether it requires use of force, I don't know. I'm on the fence on that. But the point is that now the United States is intervening globally. We are global. The United States is now a global power, whereas before, it was our neighborhood. First, it was manifest destiny, and boy, did we go after the Native Americans, right? And what's really striking is that scholars never included the Native American Indian Wars in their data sets. These were tribal nations with treaties, foreign treaties with the United States. And then you have scholars coming along trying to look at U.S. foreign policy. They're not included. So our data set is one of the ones, the only one at this point, that includes those wars in the data set. Hundreds of conflicts and battles with Native Americans. And again, that bias, or that way of thinking that you don't include those peoples, those wars, is just wrong. And so we're trying to rectify that. And then here you can look at what we were trying to do, protect our own, right? Yes, the U.S. government, the executive branch, legislative branch, Congress, the military, Department of Defense, State Department, we have an obligation to protect our own citizens, right? Two obligations, protect our territory, defense, and protect our citizens. Social protection is protecting other peoples, right, that might be harmed, might be targeted, right? Genocide, politicide. Economic, in the old days, we used force, maritime, to go after. Building foreign regimes, very difficult. We tried to do it. We loved Latin America for that. We really loved that. Territory, just trying to get territory. So you think about Cuba, Philippines, where the United States was expanding. Maintaining empire, so this is pretty much helping our allies in the early days to maintain their empires. But you know, it's not that long ago. You guys are babies, you've all been born in the 2000s. It's crazy, right? I think about that. I feel so old. But you know, the imperial project is not that, the end of the imperial project is not that old, right? So the last imperial, you know, vestiges, probably the 1980s. But there are still some, think about the Falklands, think about Gibraltar, there are still pieces of territory that are controlled that belong to or not belong to, but are under the control of great powers, major powers that were former colonizers. Policy change, so we just didn't like the policy, and then foreign imposed regime change. Again, that's when we go in and we basically take out a leader. Iran, we like to do that, and put in somebody who's more. And then if you look at what we talked about in our data set, there's different kinds of ways in which the United States could intervene. And by the way, not always on its own. Sometimes we did it multilaterally with other states. But you can threaten the use of force. You can display the use of force, so you send a gunship, a carrier. Right now we're doing a lot of this with China in the South China Sea, trying to rattle, we call that in the old days saber rattling, nice old-fashioned term. Or you can actually use force, or you can go to full-scale war. And you'll see that interstate war is the least likely, because it takes a lot, right, to mobilize your forces, to get the permission to do that. But usage of force is quite common. And there, the United States may not have declared war, but it went in and used force. So this is a very, very worrisome slide. So if you're an American citizen in this room, or if you're a global citizen in this room, what this is showing you is that in the post-2001 to Cold War, 2001 to 2017 era, the United States was much more bellicose, was resorting to the use of force, and in some cases the use of war, in a period where you could argue that existentially we were not under threat. Yes, we had 9/11, it was tragic. 3,000 souls, right, died on American soil across a number of sites. But the idea that we were facing an existential threat like we were facing during the Cold War with thermonuclear weapons that could obliterate humanity, and not just humanity, the Earth, right? And the United States just got really trigger happy. So that red, the more it darkens, it's showing you that the United States is ramping up its level of hostilities much more so in the contemporary era. And look at the 1918 to 45 period, right, where we fought 2 world wars, right? It even outpaces that in terms of our level of engagement internationally. So what this graphic is telling you is over time, again, from that 1776 to that end of the 2017, the level of US action, so going from no use, right, so of course staying back, right, not doing anything, not responding, turning the other cheek. Supposedly we're a Christian nation, not only white, right, Christian nation. What about turning the other cheek? Think about if the United States had not responded with force after 9/11, how different the world would be today. Could the United States have done that? Could President George W. Bush have done that? Or was it the case that he himself felt he needed personally vengeance for whatever reason, or he felt as if, as the leader of the United States, that the country needed vengeance? But what if he had been a leader and said, I don't think we're going to do that. I think we're going to sit back, we're going to do our homework, we're going to figure out what is going on, who are the Taliban, who is Al-Qaeda, what is the relationship between them, and maybe have a little bit more insight. Or do a demonstration effect, lob a couple bombs, we like to do that, and then see how the Taliban respond. Will they release Al-Qaeda and bin Laden? It was a very difficult decision for them because they're a Muslim society, and when you're a host, you take care of your guests. But the guest also is supposed to be a good guest. They're not supposed to start operations against a major power. Well, anyway, but we did not give any opportunity to the Taliban in those early days to possibly give over. But their leader, admittedly, Omar, he had a hard time thinking about giving over bin Laden. But we didn't give them the chance either. And as the stronger power, this is the hubris comes in. And if you're a Christian, one of the first things is turn the other cheek. Right? It's Jesus' teaching. All right, so what this is showing is that the United States' highest action is going up over time But anybody notice anything in the more contemporary period? What's happening in the blue line? That's our opposition, that's our adversaries. What's happening there? Where's that blue line going? What are you guys seeing? Anybody wanna? Yeah, it's going down, right? So what that's telling us is that as the United States is ramping up, right, its levels of hostility, our adversaries are de-escalating. Right? They're calling uncle. They say, we get it. We really don't want you guys with your missiles, your direct fire to come our way. And what's really sad about that is that we're fighting for less. And what I mean by that, if you look at US national security documents, we're fighting for secondary and tertiary interests. We're not even fighting for vital national interests. Again, we're not risking thermonuclear war here, right? The American homeland is safe. American citizens are safe, right? The global war on terrorism was a intelligence issue and a policing issue. It doesn't necessarily have to be a war. Counterterrorism is an intelligence and a policing issue. It doesn't have to be a war-fighting issue. So this is showing you, as it gets, again, lighter, not darker, that the interests over which we are fighting were lesser. Okay, so why should we care? Why should we care in this room, right? As global citizens, as global leaders, right? This is the Institute for Global Leadership. Well, first, I've already alluded to this. We're doing this, and it's not just the United States. Our allies' hands are dirty here too, right? You can think about the UK in the Middle East. You can think about France pulling us into Libya. I think we might hear a little bit about Libya. And also not making decisions to go into other countries where we actually probably could have done something better. Myanmar was raised as an issue. And I would say that Myanmar civil war has been going on for decades, and it's multi-civil wars. And we just sort of don't care, except for punctuated moments. Well, anyway, so we're ramping up the use of force at a time when it is the least effective. So these are two charts. One is Vietnam, or pictures. One is Vietnam on the left, and the other one is Afghanistan on the right. And so we're securing our interests via armed forces. It's now even more difficult, and it's a riskier environment as part of a broader trend. And the reason is our opponents know how to fight back now, right? And we just don't recognize it. Again, hubristic. They know how to innovate around us, and they give us a hard time, and then sometimes they force us, like in Vietnam and Afghanistan, to run away. We basically ran away.
Professor Toft, we're going to have to move.
Okay, all right, so can I just,
Yes,
I'll be very quick.
Yes.
So in the 19th century, we were winning most of the time, great powers, but by the 20th century, it was a 50-50 gamble, right? Second is, it's not in line with what Americans want. When polled, this will be very quick, the last six, when Americans are polled, they're not happy with the status of the United States and what it's doing. And in fact, if you ask them, should the United States a leading role or a major role, most of them say it's okay to take a major role, that the United States can rely on its allies as well. Third, the US is losing its reputation globally and its influence. And you can see that the United States, as an American, this distresses me. We are now seen as a major threat by more people than we were prior to the end of the Cold War. And then we are actually seen more as a threat in most corners of the world than Russia and China. Now, I think that we need an update on this poll, especially with Russia going into Ukraine more fully. But even so, the idea that we are seen as a threat in many corners of the world is disturbing. And then our adversaries might use our militarized behavior to justify their own. And I don't know if you can see that's President Xi, but President Xi now, or this is President Putin, basically says and uses the 1999 engagement in Kosovo as his rationale for going into Crimea in 2014 and now sort of going after 25% of Ukraine. This is President Xi, and now President Xi, even more forcefully, is naming the United States as a global bully and saying that we need, who the heck is the United States to try to contain us, right? And then we may be spending less for more. And so if you look, this is number of jobs per $1 million spent. Guess what? More jobs are made for education than they are in the defense sector. The defense sector is the least, makes the least number of jobs per $1 million spent. Whereas if you look at education, right, we can make a lot more jobs. And then lastly, this is the last bit, we're doing a lot more harm around the world than good. And here, this is just Afghanistan. If you look at Afghanistan before the war, facing food insecurity, a third jump. Children facing, under 5 facing malnutrition, Afghans living in poverty, and poverty is relative, but we've made it worse, making a lot of promises. Women's rights, yes, they were heavily restricted before, they're heavily restricted now, so we didn't really make progress there. And then the amount of money that has been thrown in Afghanistan. So, national security and foreign policy in the United States needs a rework. President Biden, I think, is trying, but he's got a lot of pressure. And we really need to think much more about that hubris humility index. You guys are all in the Fletcher School. Diplomacy, right? Intelligence, economics, in conjunction with military use of force. I'm not saying no use of force, but really we need to use it much more judiciously than we have in the past. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Professor Toft. I'm now going to pass it over to Ms. Ponde. Savita, if you'd like to share.
Thank you, Paloma, and thank you to Tufts for organizing this, for bringing all of us together for this amazing conversation, which I've been part of for the last couple of days. And thank you to Michaela, Heather, for taking such good care of us. So, so with that, I think that Monica has set us up very, very well in terms of sort of thinking about race, war, and intervention. So, as Paloma said, I run the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. And do people know about responsibility to protect in the room? Have you heard of it? Do you understand the definitions around that? Okay, so that's great. What does humanitarian intervention mean to many of you in the room? Right now we've heard about interventions and military interventions, but what does humanitarian intervention mean? Can somebody tell me? Anyone? Okay, so so when you think about humanitarian intervention, what you think is that this is an intervention to go save people's lives, to deliver aid, to do a lot of different kinds of things which are about helping people. Yeah? Broadly, that would be the definition? Okay. So the problem with the language of intervention is, and I'll start with that critique and sort of then go on about, how R2P tried to pivot that discussion, is trying to pivot that discussion. The problem with intervention is that when we think about, so where humanitarian intervention would have been needed was Rwanda. We would have stopped the genocide if only there were boots on the ground. If in Yugoslavia there was no arms embargo, we had armed the Bosnians at the right time, then there would not be a Srebrenica. So the idea is that you're thinking in terms of using military, you're thinking in terms of using that sharp end of the tool to save people's lives. Now those kinds of narratives have been propagated by all those people who have written these books on Rwanda and Bosnia and all of these different, atrocity situations. And these people are mostly coming from the northern world. I have been studying mass atrocities and genocides for, over 25 years. And I don't think I've read a single book by an African scholar on the Rwandan genocide till very recently. Even fiction was something which was so far away for me to read about it. Most of it was written by white people for a white audience to sort of also justify the thinking around that how military as an option is important. Now what this language, this intervention, this narrative does is that it precludes us from thinking about prevention. So in Rwanda, atrocity crimes as such, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, do not happen in a day. They require preparation. They require, creating sort of a structure around how you can kill. Think of the Holocaust, think of the Cambodia killing fields, think about any genocide and any sort of, crimes against humanity committed at a very large scale. It requires a lot of preparation. So what are we doing when this preparation is happening? What are we doing to prevent it? So the problem with intervention is that the intervention only focuses on response, and by that time, the horse has left the barn. And that is my problem with this language around humanitarian intervention, because A, it completely sort of throws prevention out of the window. It focuses primarily on the military response, and you can't use a hammer for everything. If the hammer is the only tool you have, then you're not really building a house, So that's sort of the first criticism. But the other criticism also is that, and this narrative about humanitarian intervention, the need for military, the boots on the ground, and I mean here I would disagree with Monica a little bit on, for example, in Myanmar. In Myanmar, we needed carrot and sticks to bring the Myanmar government to the table, and not now, but in the early 2000s or even 40 years ago, to sort of compel them by attacking their legitimacy, by attacking their means of financial support, which is the oil and gas industry, by pushing, using diplomacy, using many other different tools in the tools box, from sanctions to arms embargo, refusing to sell them aviation fuel. There's so many different levers that you have. So if you use the entire toolbox, then what you get is more space to act, and you have sort of less harm on the ground. Because as Monica's presentation showed us with Afghanistan, in most of these situations, when you apply the prudential criteria, any of these interventions led to more harm than good. So that's sort of the thought process on intervention, and I hope that this also feeds into our discussion this afternoon on genocide prevention. So the other sort of thing that I want to bring to the table is the idea of the responsibility to protect. Now, the idea of the responsibility to protect came out of sort of the failures around Rwanda and Bosnia and sort of the bombing impossible, and it was sort of thinking about how we can protect populations from conscience-shocking crimes of genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and what can the UN do as a system? What can the multilateral system do? So again, it's not about one state, it's not about unilateral action, it's about multilateral action. And at the time of the conception of R2P, it was very much around sort of, the military toolbox. But as, there's an ISIS report which comes out with the idea of responsibility to protect, and then there is the World Summit in 2005, and then you have R2P adopted in the World Summit outcome documents for the 3 paragraphs. And the R2P basically, but in its inception too, what R2P does is that it changes the narrative. So instead of it becoming about the right to dream, because this is what Bernard Kouchner, the French foreign minister, talked about, like when people are when people are in jeopardy, when people are getting attacked, we have a right to it. Yeah, so again, it's a very paternalistic, it has this white man's burden issue to it, it is a savior complex. So what you're trying to do then again is to go and save these people without sort of seeing that these people also have agencies. It's a very paternalistic, colonial, neoliberal kind of thing. Whereas R2P pivots that discussion into it becoming about responsibility to protect. We should not be bystanders when people are getting killed. When people are subjected to genocide. We should, if only the world had stood up for the Jews, the Holocaust would not have happened. If only we would have stood up for the Cambodians, the killing fields of Cambodia wouldn't have happened. How much time do I have left? Okay. So those are sort of so with the responsibility to protect, we have pivoting the discussion, and the pivot of the discussion is that it's not about just responding, it's also about prevention. It's about prevention in the sense that we help the state, because sometimes, I would give you an example of Central African Republic or even the DRC. The government is not unwilling, the government is unable. They just do not have the institutional capacity, and the problems are so big that they are unable to protect their populations. So it starts with sort of bolstering because the primary responsibility to protect populations, and again, here the use of the word populations, because it's not about citizens, it's not about civilians either. It means populations. Populations, everybody who is within your boundaries. And populations also includes combatants, because you should not be committing war crimes either. So R2P thinks in terms of protecting populations from these 4 conscience-shocking crimes. It's about prevention, building the capacity of the state. if the state is unable, then you provide capacity bilaterally, multilaterally. So in countries where there has been sort of a history of atrocity crimes. So one of the things that we talk about in terms of prevention is that prevention starts by acknowledging the crimes of the past. Now Monica brought up the whole idea of indigenous populations. Within this entire neoliberal sense of like how do we protect them, how do we save people in Africa, in Asia, the Western countries, have completely sort of denied their the first sort of recorded genocides which were against indigenous populations. You know, from the Americas are particularly, I mean, they have a violent history of how they have just killed away. I mean, and it was about wiping a certain kind of people, so these are genocides. So again, so what do you do then? I am a country A, and I'm thinking Timor-Leste. You know, Timor-Leste had this entire history of atrocity crimes, and you know, once they through the UN processes and everything, it was about, you know, again, these words like reconstruction and rebuilding are really problematic too, because what are you rebuilding? What was already there was a problematic thing. What we need to think about is in terms of transformation, and transformation happens when there is a intersection between peace and justice, and a good transitional justice process. And all of this requires us to acknowledge the crimes of the past, to honor those victims, and to try very, very hard through legislative processes, through education systems, through all our institutions, to make sure that the society develops resilience and that it doesn't sort of slide into a phase where the risk of atrocity crimes is high. So Timor-Leste is thinking about this. Who helps Timor-Leste out? Argentina. Why Argentina? Because Argentina had a violent dictatorship under which, you know, thousands disappeared, thousands were killed, and Argentina has done a fantastic job about memorialization, about acknowledging the atrocities of the past. Because by acknowledging the atrocities of the past, it has created a consensus within society. You know, you talk to, there's so many Brazilians here, you talk to Argentinians. In Brazil this didn't happen, but we talk to Argentinians, they will tell you that how much ever the government is populist, there's still so much consensus around human rights. Is it perfect? Not really, but there's a lot of consensus. And that consensus happened because of a good transitional justice process, about truth-telling, memorization, also punitive actions. They held individual military leaders responsible. So a host of actions then led to sort of Argentina developing resilience. And when Timor-Leste was thinking about this, who helps Timor-Leste? Argentina helps. You know, the same way Argentina sort of provides bilateral help to South Africa in terms of identifying, I mean, and multiple countries have done this. Guatemala has helped Bosnians in identifying, you know, who has died because everybody was thrown into mass graves. So these are different ways in which we can help each other. And then sort of the final is the third pillar of R2P, which is a more, the sharper end of the toolbox. But that doesn't only include military, because in most situations you don't need the military. In Myanmar, right now, even after the Rohingya genocide and the coup, military action is not going to get you anywhere. You know, it's just going to create a conflict where there are multiple parties to the conflict. What you need is to compel the government of Myanmar through denying them aviation fuel, making sure that their oil and gas sectors are sanctioned to a degree that they're unable to sustain committing atrocities against their own population. In Yemen, we need, first of all, we need the Saudis and UAEs and everybody out of the picture, but we need, again, a transitional justice process. We need, you know, we need name and shame, not only the Saudi coalition, but also the UK, France, and US's role in committing atrocities in Yemen. You know? So there's so many different kinds of things within that toolbox. Arms embargoes, sanctions, good offices, diplomacy. Of course, military action should be on the table. But every time we think in terms of military action, we have to think in terms of prudential criteria. For example, when the war on Ukraine started, literally a lot of people came to me and said, what are you guys doing on this? You should be advocating for military action. And I'm like, there are already two parties to the conflict. It's not, because wars are not fought in that same way. What you're seeing is Ukraine is street fighting, you know. what you're seeing in Ukraine is, it's not, I mean, there is a lot of use of indiscriminate bombings, but it's civilians fighting with the Russian military, which is also not that very well trained. And so it's a big mess. I mean, what we saw in Iraq, Afghanistan, when you fight sort of the insurgency, or when you fight people, in Vietnam too, the problems were that in all of these sort of settings, the militaries are trained to fight on borders. The nature of modern warfare is totally different. It's urban warfare. You're fighting from street to street. And in this case, the house always wins, because the house knows geography very well. They know, I mean, for them it's an existential thing, versus for you, Afghanistan, Iraq, all of these examples show us how intervening forces always fail. So with Ukraine, again, it was, and I was like, what do you want to do? This is a nuclear power, Russia. And if there's any kind of military response, then everybody becomes party to the conflict, and you have a third world war on your hands. So we have to think about how we deal with Ukraine, but military option is not the right option. It'll do more harm than it'll do good. And also in response to Ukraine, I mean, a lot of sort of governments tried to frame it, oh, we are preventing Ukrainians from atrocity camps. Not really, you're just punishing Russia, So, I mean, sanctions, there's so much learning on sanctions through Iraq and everything, where targeted sanctions are helpful, blanket sanctions actually hurt the populations. But on Iran, on Russia, we have thrown away all that learning, and then you're back to sort of a very punitive system through which you're trying to get Russia to the table. So anyway, I mean, but again, war on Ukraine, race wars, again, this completely, very starkly brings into perspective that whose lives are more important. So right after the invasion happened, everybody was asking, oh, you must be so busy. And I was like, actually, we're not that busy, because everything we asked on 24th of February, we released a statement. We asked for the Russia to be removed from the HRC, from the Human Rights Council, uniting for peace, to the General Assembly, Security Council resolutions, referencing to the ICC, everything we asked for, within a week and a half, the international community came together and all measures were implemented. On Ethiopia to Myanmar to Syria, just getting one thing done, one open meeting in the UN Security Council on Myanmar, it's still not happened, and as advocates, we're still fighting for it. So again, it's like the hierarchy of victimhood is very much determined by the color of your skin. And sort of the final point I would like to make is, again, I mean, and Monica highlighted this in her presentation, that the fact is this hubris, of knowing better. So with R2P, what the shift has been, there have been a few shifts. So one is, you focus on prevention. You think about every tool in the toolbox, you focus on prevention, and you build resilient societies, You provide as much assistance to countries that are unable. You really invest in justice mechanisms to hold perpetrators responsible, do the truth-telling, and truth-telling which centers the affected populations. It's not about me or Paloma, it's about the Afghan women. So it's not about inserting oneself into the discussion, it's actually asking them what is it that they want, how do they want their society to change. So we work, at the Global Center, we work with a lot of affected communities. So right now we are involved in creating a mechanism which basically Syrian families have come together. They have created a few organizations, because the war has been going on for such a long time that families have become activists, and they are the people who are now asking for response. So there are over 300,000 people are either disappeared or detained. Their families don't know their fate. So we are trying to create an institution through the General Assembly to find the fate of the missing and the detained. And this whole campaign has been led by Syrian families. And when we are working with them, demanding states to help them set up this institution, we are centering the voices of the Syrian families. We ourselves are not going to the meetings and talking, we are actually centering them. And by centering them, not only in terms of they telling their stories, but centering them, that asking them really, what is it that they want, inserting them into policy discussions. Because if we craft or develop policies without the voices of the affected community, I mean, yesterday we heard from, it isn't not just about community participation, they have to be community led, they have to be dictated, the vision has to be constructed by the communities. And if it is not, then it will not be successful. And this is the case that we have learned through the work that we have done over 70, 80 years of the development cooperation, the international development cooperation. Have we eradicated poverty? No, because in most of these cases, the projects and how we sort of deal with poverty in Guatemala is dictated by New York, which doesn't have any connection to actually the people of Guatemala. So again, like development, human rights, humanitarian, all of this stuff is extremely skewed to only consider the point of view of how Western countries think about these different norms. It doesn't really have a perspective. It's very normative, it's very driven by the West, and we're trying to change that slowly, but the change is slow in coming. So I'll stop that. There are just many random thoughts, I think, in the presentation, but I hope that they benefited you just in thinking about like what intervention means versus race versus war versus, how do we think about securitized responses to everything. And again, I mean, the final point is that, again, like if you only use the military, every response is securitized, and that's also a serious problem. You can't tackle climate change by just fighting insurgencies, because armed groups across, right now, across Central Sahel, Nigeria, elsewhere, you have a proliferation of bandit groups, armed groups. They're not a result just of the fact that there's a lot of weapons in these places, but it's a result of extreme deprivation. It's a result of zero-sum game. It's a result of climate change. We are seeing entire spots of land becoming not fit for living anymore. So all of this is contributing to a crisis, a security crisis, but the response cannot be security. The response has to be rooted in what the communities want and how we move forward from there. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sangeeta. Okay, Professor Knight, if you'd like to present now, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Very good. First of all, I want to congratulate the students for putting on this EPIIC Symposium 2023. Professor Abby Williams for guiding the students along. I've been involved in some of these in the past, and I'm always amazed at the quality and the level of conversations having to do with how can we make the world a better place. It gives me a lot of hope that the younger people, many people who consider young people to be tomorrow's leaders, I tend to think of them as tomorrow's leaders today. I don't think you have to be until you're 40 to become a leader. You people, the young people today, are leaders today, and that's reflected in the kind of discussions that we're having right now. Secondly, I want to say thanks to other members of the panel, Monica and Ms. Ponde, sorry. Both of you have done a tremendous job in laying out, both in terms of empirical examples of the challenge that we face right now, both in terms of U.S. National security and foreign policy problems, and as well the global problem of responsibility to protect. And I was one of those people who were very engaged at the very beginning of the creation of the Center for Responsibility to Protect. And my only regret was that I wasn't able to continue as director of the center when I was asked, when it was first created, because of family reasons and the difficulties of trying to live in New York City when my family was in Western Canada. But having said that, I want to say that I've admired the work that's been done on R2P since then, and the work that's being currently done really demonstrates that this narrative of R2P is shifting. I think it's shifting in the right direction. As Ms. Ponde put it, there is a move away from the paternalistic view of humanitarian intervention towards much more humanistic view of dealing with conflicts, particularly focusing on prevention rather than military aggression. and the need to, I think there are a couple of things I want to stress in my talk today, and that is the need to go back to history to understand the underlying reasons why conflicts are created in the first place. I think that's one of our challenges. It's not sufficient to wait until wars break out. It's not sufficient to wait until we have a genocide in Rwanda, or it's not sufficient to wait until Myanmar goes apart before we start to act. The focus should be on prevention at an early stage, and sometimes, in order to be able to do that, we have to acknowledge the past. And the past, in large part, the past that we are acknowledging is one of racism. I call it the original sin. The Europeans. The Europeans and enslavement of Africa, which also led to the transatlantic slave trade. I think that's the original sin of the Europeans. It's created a global apartheid system where blacks and brown and indigenous peoples have been marginalized and treated as less than human. And this is one of the reasons why we've had these successive conflicts around the globe. If you go back to the European, what I call the European locusts, the explorers, the slave traders, the merchants, the missionaries, the imperialists, who arrived in the 15th century in Africa and took slaves away from individuals from Africa to the Caribbean and to the Americas, and enslaved them and ravaged them, ravaged the continent of Africa, ravaged the individuals who came from that continent, spread the destructive diseases and plagues and pestilences, and engaged in what I can only call a genocide of the black race. This is, to me, where it begins. And we need to go back into history and understand why we need to decolonize our curriculum. We need to decolonize our thinking, which is very, very much being Eurocentric thinking, which, again, as some of the speakers point out, is about white savior ideology, right? It's about white man's burden. It's about sort of treating other people who are not white as being lesser than those who are. And that's been, in large part, the reason why the Americans, for example, Americans have been involved in these conflicts over and over again in Latin America and the Caribbean. That's why Haiti is the way it is today. That's why many countries in Asia and Africa have been suffering over the years from what I call a slow genocide in some ways, because their people are treated as less than human, as less than equal. Now, the UN Charter is supposed to give us hope that all people will be treated as equals, that people will be respected for their humanity, regardless of the color of the skin, regardless of their gender, regardless of their abilities, and regardless of their indigeneity. They will all be respected as equals. But the reality is, then we have a responsibility to protect norm that doesn't allow for these individuals who've been marginalized over the years to sit at the table and to make decisions about what needs to be protected and who needs to be protected. Then we have a problem that we need to resolve. I link it right back to the days of colonization, the continuation of slavery by other means. I spent some time in Ghana looking at what is called the door of no return, and it had a major impact on me, on my heart, my soul. Was affected by what I saw. When I started thinking about the individuals who were forced to leave Africa to go to a place where they didn't know where they were going. Many of them died in those, like Amina Castle, the castle where they were being held as a holdover before going on those ships that led them to the Caribbean and Latin America. Some of them jumped off those ships and killed themselves because they didn't know where they were going to be taken. It really sort of helped me to realize the extent to which the dehumanization of African peoples, the dehumanization of black people, brown people, indigenous people, the genocide of these individuals is at the root cause of many of the problems that we have today. So from 1450 to 1888, we had African slaves, for example, working on plantations in the Caribbean and in the Americas. The world's largest African diaspora is now in this part of the world because of that transatlantic slave trade. This slave trade was obviously profit-driven. Individuals who were black and brown who worked on the plantations, some of them indigenous peoples, so some of them black people from Africa, some of them Indian people from East India. They all were contributing in some ways to this profit-driven exploitation of the Europeans. And it covered so-called the mission, they covered this sort of exploitation with the sort of biblical language, Christian ideology about civilizing the uncivilized. So by creating this sort of two-tier system of civilized people who were white and non-civilized people who were not, they were able to gloss over the inhumanity that resulted in colonization. And capitalism as an ideology, capitalism combined with white Christian nationalism, these things became the underlying ideological forces driving this issue. So this civilization mission was legitimized basically by Western leaders, by philosophers, by capitalists, by churches, by scientists, and we even have academics who have actually led the charge to create some sort of justification for this inhumanity. We've had resistances against that in Haiti, we've had resistances in Jamaica, in Barbados, in many parts of the world, resistances in the southern parts of the United States, as you know, the Jim Crow days and so on, which was not that long ago. So the creation of the Black Slave Code, which was a legalization of what it would call today global apartheid. It was a legalization of the separation of the races that pitted the white folks above anyone else. That Black Slave Code had created the kinds of punishments that we see perpetuated today in the police forces. The punishments that are created today by the military forces, and the punishments by those people who try to enslave or enforce their position over others. And between 1450 to 1888, there were something like 12 to 15 million Africans who were forcibly transported to the Caribbean and the Americas in this notorious transatlantic slave trade. And, you know, the British are responsible, the French are responsible, the Portuguese are responsible, the Spanish are responsible, the Dutch are responsible, the Danes are responsible, the Swedes are responsible, the Belgians are responsible. These are all countries where the majority of the populations are white. The others are considered to be lesser than human in many cases. So until we sort of go back into history, until we understand where this problem emanates from, we're going to have this issue of violence and militarism and so on perpetuated over and over again until we can address those underlying problems. That's why I believe very strongly in what Ms. Pondy was saying about the need to transform the language and the narrative of responsibility to protect away from humanitarian interventions and this notion of rebuilding. Why would you want to rebuild something that was already improperly built in the first place? You know, get rid of this white savior mentality, get rid of this white man's burden ideology, acknowledge the crimes of the past, transform, focus on transformation as opposed to simply intervention, military intervention. As Monica says, that if you have a hammer and you think that that's the only tool that you can use to do everything, then you're basically going to destroy humanity that way. So look at the other tools that are available to us, tools of justice, of education, of truth-telling, reconciliation, and I would say lastly, reparations. If you want to build a just society, if you want to give people who have been marginalized and suppressed over the years the capacity and the ability to live decent lives and to live just lives, you have to give them the tools that are necessary for them to do that. And one of the ways to do this is to give them capacity by reparations, paying back for and trying to atone for some of the sins, what I call the original sin of the Europeans. Many of these European countries have to give reparations back to countries that have been decimated by the trade, the transatlantic slave trade. Many of these countries that are now impoverished because their wealth was taken away from them and transported to the center, to the European center. And they've been left with the burden of debt that's been so crippling. And on top of that, have to deal with the problems of climate change that were not created by themselves, but created by the Western industrial countries. This climate change problem has caused them to be put in further debt because they have to deal with manifold problems stemming from hurricanes and the like. That needs to be addressed with money. And the only way that you can do that is going to be through reparations to those countries that have been hard hit by this original sin of the Europeans. I'm going to leave it there. I hope that's enough to give you something to work on. But I think in some ways it ties together those two previous presentations by forcing us to look at the original reasons why, the underlying reasons why we have the problems that we find ourselves in today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Knight. I don't know if people want to go straight into audience questions. Otherwise, I know Diego seems to have a question. So Diego, if you'd like to start us off, and then we can transition to others. And please use the microphones on either side for your questions.
Yes, should be working now. Okay. Thank you very much. It's really a good thing I'm able to exchange with you on this. Hello, Professor Toss. I don't know if Kenny will remember. It's a question for the two of you, if you don't mind. In regards to responsibility to protect, it's a very important concept that has made a difference in international relations. Some people say, okay, responsibility to protect, and what about the right to be protected? And all the ramifications from that. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about where do we stand on that, the right to be protected, and how persons at the receiving end have the ability to generate that kind of prioritization. And for Professor Toft, is very interesting what you mentioned about these interventions. And I'm also a historian, and I immediately, I've been shaped by reading that book by Gibbons, Declining the Roman Empire. And since we're talking here about race, what are the implications of this overstretching in terms of military interventions and the social tissue back at home? Yeah, some people talk about the industrial military complex, but the fact is that so many wars need many soldiers, and it creates kind of a very interesting set of incentives in society. If you are in a situation in which you need social mobility, signing up for service seems to be one of the fastest things to do that. And it seems that we create a kind of incentives in a way that intends certain effects. Is there anything we can do about that? How do we see it from the domestic perspective?
Well, thank you for that fantastic question, Diego. No, absolutely. I think that right to be protected is something which populations have always fought for and demanded, actually. I think that R2P gives a framework, but I don't know how many of you saw right after the coup in Myanmar. There were marches and protests which young people to old people all across Myanmar were carrying these posters of R2P and saying, we need to be protected by this regime which is bent upon killing us. So, that's a very sort of stark example of people like using the language of R2P and saying that we need to be protected. Recently, last year, in October, it was, now time has no concept anymore, but it was 2021 that, the Sudanese, after Bashir was thrown out, and again, Bashir as a dictator, his regime fell apart because of the protests on the street. And right after that, we have this council, and then the military again dissolves that council and orchestrates a coup. And despite a lot of personal threats on people, you had thousands and thousands of people in Sudan protesting and asking for democracy back because they did not think that the regime as it is will be protecting them. Iran, so it's like the examples never end of how populations consistently assert their right to be protected, asking the international community to help in this endeavor. Recently we've been working a lot with Venezuelan civil society, and the process has been led by them. And this is a process about getting a fact-finding mission, created and renewed every year. And the role of the fact-finding mission is to look at Venezuela, look at the root causes, which is causing the kind of disappearances and an intense amount of repression on the population. And just by the fact that there is an international body which is looking at the situation, it's not as if the regime has stopped committing crimes, but they're just better at now hiding it, but they're still hiding it, So the thing is that populations consistently, assert their right to be protected. It's just that who is heard and when they are heard is the problem in the system, and that is what we have to address, that the international community comes together for some and doesn't come together for others. So that remains. Selectivity around implementation is still a major issue, and we're trying to address that by making sure that we're bringing in more and more voices from affected communities, really bringing them on the world stage, making them part of the policy making, so that we can shift how we respond to crises.
So Diego, I think your question is about incentives and sort of fighting back, and the fact that we tend to resort to the use of force much more readily. Is that sort of what you're trying to get at?
And also the stress that places on society, that conflict seems to be the hammer that people resort to.
Yeah, they do, and I think when I think about it, when I'm with my students in the classroom, I say what's really driving this is power, right? And I think Andy and Zvi have talked a bit about that. And when I think about it domestically in the United States, but when I think about it globally, since this is a conference about racism, I think of white fright, and whites don't want to give up power. So the insurrection of January 6th, make no mistake, that was white nationalism. What's the fastest growing group in the United States along racial ethnic lines? It's mixed race. My children are mixed race. I'm proud of that. And truth be told, if humans, we can go really big, any of you biology majors or evolutionary biology majors, the natural thing for humans to do is miscegenation, right? We should all be sort of tannish, not me pink. Why am I pink? Because my ancestors formed tribes. It was a survival, right? We think about Darwin and survival of the fittest and reproduction. And if they could protect the boundaries of our community, they felt as if they could survive as a tribe, right? Irish, Celtic, little German in there. But this is what humans have done, and they've put in structures in place, political and social structures, to ensure the survivability of their community. But we're smart now. We're educated. We have empathy. We understand that all humans have emotions, and they all want the best for their children and their communities. Yet these structures, and I think Andy, you did a brilliant job on that, these structures are still in place, and we still have a lag effect of them. And so one of the projects I'm working on is, from the Afghanistan one is the demographic collapse of states, right? So what happens when the majority in a state is no longer the majority? That's what's happening in the United States, by the way. And I have written an article, if anybody wants to read it, but I'm writing a book about this for a variety of states. I'm thinking about the imperial order in China, right, before the Boxer Rebellion. There was the Taiping, and there was a lot of racism in that. The Han were nervous about minority groups. But the Soviet Union, I make an argument, and others who are even more expert than I are compelled by it, that one of the reasons why, among many, that the Soviet Union collapsed was the differential birth rates of Muslims in the Stans and in sort of the border areas of the Soviet Union. And in 1979, that became really apparent. And the Soviet elite hid the census. They would not publish a census because they were nervous that if the Muslim populations in the Stans, in parts of Georgia, in Azerbaijan, that they were going to make more demands on the states. Hey, we're bigger numbers. We have a right to more resources. Why should the Slavs control everything? And Moscow was controlling it. But the Muscovites, the Slavs in Russia, saw themselves as co-brethren with the Belarusians and the Ukrainians. And so there was nervousness that demands would be put on the state if the Muslim populations knew that they had the numbers to make more demands on the system. And I think that this is what's happening in Europe with populations, as you guys are going to talk about migration later today. But this is really about protecting boundaries, because by protecting boundaries of the community, you're protecting power structures. And Andy, I think you're right. One of the things that has to happen here is education. And those who are being left behind, if they're being left behind, President Trump, he got a lot of support from people who really suffered during the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and into the 2000s for the failing economy in the United States. Starting in the 1970s, right, we had global energy crises, and all of a sudden women were going to the workforce, and by the way, never stepped back, right? It was the 1970s where women, you had to have that dual income family. And there were a number of people, look at Detroit, the Rust Belt in the American Midwest, that lost jobs. And then we had a horrific drug crisis. Basically, this country is run by drug cartels, right? The pharmaceutical company, if you're anybody who's a grandparent, you look at the number of drugs that our elderly are on, right? And the opioid crisis really harmed this country. It's still continuing to harm it. And so President Trump's message really resonated with people who have been left behind, right? And we have to take that seriously. And many of them are the non-high school, they're high school educated white males. And these high school educated white males feel like they're being left behind. And so we need to listen to them. We need to be attuned to those communities. But by the way, this is happening globally. And by the way, for the young women in the room, you're doing much better than the men. Men are being left behind. The women are outperforming the men. And this is global. And women are choosing not to get married, right? And so the men, there's concern, what's going to happen to these men who can't find their partners, right? So you're going to see migration and trafficking in some cases. But in any event, these are really deep, profound, complex, dynamic issues. And so I think it comes back to power and whether we have the capacity as a human community to recognize it in our localities, NIMBY, not in my neighborhood, not in my front yard, right? It emanates all the way up globally to what's happening. And so hopefully some of you as leaders can help us to get more traction on it, because it's happening. You know, when friends of mine, I come from a somewhat conservative, some of my family is conservative, I try to talk to them about it. And I say, you may not get left behind, and so what if we open up the political space, the social space? Let's do it. And think about ways in which we can coexist, because that's what it's about. And I think, for me, my life's been dedicated trying to alleviate human suffering. There's a lot of human suffering psychically and, of course, physically as a result of people not wanting to share and open up social and political spaces to one another.
Beatrice, did you have a question?
On? Yeah,
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hello, people for the presentation. It was really great. My name is Beatriz. I'm a law student at the University of Symposium, Brazil. And this discussion about the responsibility to protect reminded me that the invasion of Ukraine, Russia, was justified with the genocide convention. So the invasion was based on the argument that Ukraine was attacking the population of self-proclaimed republics and in the eastern Ukraine. And Russia claimed that acts perpetrated by Ukraine amounted to genocide, and that the genocide convention authorizes the use of force to prevent genocide. So to what extent can the Russian invasion, can the Russian justification for the invasion be seen as a manipulation of the responsibility to protect doctrine? And how does it challenge the legitimacy and the effectiveness of this norm? And also, in light of this case, how can the international community prevent the misuse of the R2P doctrine to justify aggression, particularly in cases where it is raised based on allegations of genocide?
Well, thank you for that question. I think that question was was asked so many times right after the Ukrainian invasion. So Russia has used the language around protecting Russian populations in their neighborhood, and then thus attacking a few times. So again with Georgia, with Southern Ossetia, and then now again with this whole claim that the Ukrainians themselves Ukrainians are killing ethnically Russian population in the Donbas region, and that was the reason for their going in to protect their populations. The thing is that the war in Donbas has been happening since 2014. There have been multiple human rights monitoring mechanisms which have been present there, and crimes against humanity and war crimes have been committed by both sides. There is no real evidence based on the monitoring of UN that ethnically Russian populations have been particularly attacked. So there is no evidence really of genocide. But there is evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity. I mean, as a lawyer, you'll see that, so there is no, so basically no evidence. So it's just basically using whatever arguments you can to further, your own sort of interventionist or, land grabbing agendas. And the thing is that like no norm, So with Afghanistan, Monica spoke about this very eloquently. With Afghanistan, at the time in 2001, after 9/11, some of the justification also by the American government is we are trying to protect women's rights. So people use whatever justification they can to make themselves feel better or to sort of, assert a certain argument within the international community. Norms don't have agency, they rely on responsible actors for their implementation. So this is not the first time, and this is not going to be the last time that R2P is going to be used as a way to justify invasion. R2P was also used in the context of Iraq. But the thing is that that's an illegitimate claim, because R2P can only be sort of evoked, for a lack of a better word, from the UN Security Council. So those claims will exist, will happen again. But again, our job as advocates is to constantly sort of course correct and is to constantly sort of be out there and challenge these narratives to say that, okay, so what is the evidence, of your supposedly genocide being committed against ethnically Russian population?
Very much for that question. I don't know if any of the other panelists want to answer. We'll move on to another question.
I just want to make one comment. So when we think about R2P, we think about just war theory. These are ideals. So even if we don't achieve them perfectly, at least we're striving for the ideal. I beat up a lot on the American project here, but we have a fantastic constitution. And we actually have a pretty good history relative to the rest of the world if you think about human history. But the American project is an ideal. And so we need to keep working toward that ideal. So don't get dissuaded, don't get sad, depressed. If is the case that we fail, right, at certain moments, because what we're trying to achieve is ideals and course correct along the way. So an R2P is an ideal. We don't have the resources at this point to really effectuate it and to make it happen, but it's a beautiful ideal, that the idea that states cannot predate, should not predate on their populations, and that the global citizens are going to hold them responsible. That is beautiful. And we'll get there someday, I hope. Maybe beyond my lifetime, maybe not, but I doubt it. Especially, I hope we get there sooner, especially because it's been raised by both Annie and Savitha. Climate change is sitting right there, folks. And we're going to have a whole lot of hurt beyond just what we're doing to one another. Mother Nature is calling.
Professor Nai, I don't know if you wanted to respond to the question as well.
Well, I just wanted to say that, I think you're absolutely right that R2P is more or less an aspiration. It's something that we are aiming towards. And I think you have to put it in that context. It's not going to, these things are going to happen overnight. But I think what's important, in trying to develop R2P solutions to some of the problems that we face is to make sure that the people who are at the table making that decision are inclusive of people who will be marginalized, people who will be cast aside in the past. If you really want to talk about equity and diversity and inclusion, this is a very good place to put that into practice within the development of responsibility to protect practices and norms. And of course, I do believe that the focus on responsibility to protect has been in some ways misguided in the past, and that we need to refocus attention on prevention. I like what our speaker said, what Sponde said about the need to focus on prevention, the tools of prevention. We have those tools. It's not as though we have to recreate the tools. They've already been created. If you look at Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, you can see quite clearly laid out the kinds of tools that are necessary to allow us to coexist as people. And so it's not a matter of trying to reinvent the wheel. I think they're already there, that we can utilize those tools.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I think we might have time for one more question, if you'd like to.
Hello. Thank you so much for the presentations. I wanted to ask whether or not do you believe that the narratives included in speeches of high-level politicians about Middle Eastern terrorism, for example, have had a role in justifying U.S. interventions?
I think that's a terrific question, and it's a nice one to sort of close in on since this is IGL. Yes, rhetoric matters, language matters, discourse matters. And so what I would hope is that as you're sitting in your classrooms learning, you learn the power of speech, you learn the power of history, and that you have a choice about how you frame. So one of the papers we just finished on Afghanistan is that President George W. Bush decided to frame almost immediately the situation in Afghanistan as a global war on terror. And it was just one venue, just one. In fact, he didn't care. We talk about Afghanistan in the paper, that Afghanistan became an abstraction and just a layover stop in order for the United States to prosecute a broader war. Think about if President Gore had been in power, who, by the way, was obsessed at this moment with climate change. Think about if President Biden, when he was under President Obama as his vice president, did not want the surge in 2006, 2007, just didn't want it. Right? But President Obama listened to the military, and the military said, hey boss, I promise to be quick and dirty. It was sort of an elephant that everybody had their hand on, but nobody knew exactly what was going on. 20 years in Afghanistan, guys, 20 years, and the death and destruction there that we witnessed. But in any event, it starts at the top. And how you frame, we've talked about the narratives, and I think Andy did a really good job talking about sort of language, right, and really going back in time, that where did this come from, like this understanding. And I talked about the institutionalization of this, the politicization of this, and then how our communities have sort of been structured around. So I absolutely, it's a great question. Think about that. Could somebody have framed it differently so that it opens up different policy options. And again, I started my talk with the commissions in the United States and in Europe that are looking at the fiasco, the catastrophe in Afghanistan, are not allowed to ask why they failed. They have to ask, why do the Afghans fail? So I think language, how things are framed, are extraordinarily important. And keep that in mind as you move forward. Is there a different way to frame this so that we can open up more possibilities, more opportunities to make the world safer for all of us?
On there, Professor Nick.
No, I mean, I agree with Monica. I think that, you know, it's about framing the war, framing discussions around crises of human rights, crises that are a result of extreme deprivation, crises that are a result of climate change in the context of terrorism has truly had a very bad impact on the world. I think that the other sort of, you know, just sort of the rhetoric, no? So the war on terror, the war on drugs. I mean, why is everything this war? Why aren't we thinking in terms of, you know, like you've just securitized every response to every problem. And right now we're also securitizing the response to climate change. We're not talking in terms of climate justice and I mean, you know, how we can engineer transformations in places which are really at the receiving end of climate change. We're just talking in terms of security and climate change. How can we securitize every response? And I think that that's the problem, because again, as I said, if you only have a hammer in your toolbox, you can't build a house, you know. And again, I mean, the other sort of point about rhetoric and about narratives and about language is that how right now in the world, what we see is such an incredible rise in hate speech. You know, I mean, it's of course aided by the fact that, you know, you have social media, communication has changed dramatically. But hate speech has always existed. And hate speech is where demonization begins. Hate speech is where othering begins. And hate speech, when it is employed, I mean, you know, in the US we saw with Trump and, you know, elsewhere around the world, when you start demonizing or othering other populations, the risk for atrocities increases, the risk for, you know, human rights violations against that group increases, because you're creating an environment which is permissive, which allows violence to be perpetrated against those kinds of groups. And I mean, and this is what we're seeing in Afghanistan, because, you know, when we talk about and this is my final point, for gender persecution, it's not just about sort of sexual and gender-based violence against women across the globe, it's also gender persecution. When you start thinking, when you create a society where gender persecution is normalized, where hate speech against women is normalized, where you know, women are seen as manipulative rather than assertive, or you're creating just an environment where it's permissive to be violent against them. So, yeah, rhetoric absolutely matters, language matters, narratives matter, because then they set the course for history.
Thank you, Ms. Ponde. Professor Knight, would you like to respond as well?
Yeah, and I agree 100% with what was just said by Ms. Ponde about how you frame issues really can make a difference. And I wonder, we haven't talked at all about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in this discussion, but I can't help but think about the way in which that conflict is being framed by some Israeli politicians to give the impression that that the problem is Palestine rather than Israel, and that makes a difference in terms of how we respond to that issue. You know, what we see in front of us today on television, a lot of it has to do with the kind of racial rhetoric that was said by some Israeli politicians. We have to be very truthful about that. And of course, yes, the Palestinians have been throwing stones at Israelis, and there'll be some sort of reaction. But a lot of it has to do with the way in which Palestinian people have been treated since Israel became a state. So I think we have to go back again, look at the root causes of these problems, look at the history, look at the way in which the conflicts have been framed by one side or the other, if we're going to have any sort of hope of coexisting peacefully in the future.
Thank you very much. Let's see what time we're at. I think if you want to ask a question, we'll have one more question before we close out. No, as well.
I'd like to thank you for your presentation. It was really insightful. I'm just having like a look in the solutions as a scholar of IR and like I'm planning to do a master in diplomacy. I was just wondering whether we could, as a global community, how we could limit the American intervention and like political involvement in every corner of the earth. And if that is an option, would it be like through an institution? Because like we have seen the limits of the United Nations. Yes, thank you.
I'll keep it very short because we're over, but I just think enlightened leadership. In a sense, China's doing us a favor because we're redirecting and refocusing, because we see China potentially as a threat, as becoming, it's not yet a pure competitor, but it has to be enlightened leadership. I mean, the American defense budget is up over $800 billion. I mean, it's just crazy, it's nuts. We were warned about this in the 1950s by President Eisenhower in the military-industrial complex. And so it's got to be enlightened leadership and then citizens who vote and say, I don't want this, I want a healthier society, I want infrastructure that works. So it's going to have to be the combination of that enlightened leadership and saying enough on the defense side, and then citizens putting in demands. I mean, I put that chart up that, you know, federal defense spending, you only get 7 jobs, whereas education sector you get upwards of 20, 25. I would much rather have citizens who, you know, are better educated than fighting wars, which now it's a crapshoot, you know, 50-50 whether we're even going to win them.
I mean, see, the power of the United States is unmatched. I mean, it's a unipolar world. And that's the reason, I mean, to check great powers, we need a multipolar world. And we have, I mean, I think that after the end of the Cold War, there was some movement towards a multipolar world, but it doesn't exist. So I think that you limit American interventionism by creating a multipolar world, and sort of the other response would be to really hold aggressors accountable. I mean, right now there are talks about, you know, holding a tribunal for crimes against aggression. You holding Russia responsible for that. But I mean, you know, the Iraq intervention and Afghanistan intervention one could argue that that is a crime of aggression. You know, like you can change the rhetoric, oh, it's war on terror, and Iraq was, I don't know what it was, but you know, the invasion in Iraq was very much a crime of aggression against one state against another. So I think that it's about sort of thinking in terms of accountability, and the only sort of answer, I mean, and this is a long-term answer, I don't know whether it's even possible, because with the rise of China, we might move to a bipolar world in the next 50, 60 years, but the chances of the multipolar world doesn't exist. And the only way you can check great power is having multipolar world.
Thank you very much. I don't know, Professor Knight, if you have any response to the question?
Well, to the young lady who wants to think in terms of diplomacy as a career, I think I want to encourage you to go in that direction. Because right now we're living in an increasingly ungovernable world, particularly since the end of the Cold War, 1989, 1992. We've been really living in a new world disorder. What has happened to the United Nations in terms of the ways in which the foundational principles of the United Nations are being challenged by many countries, including countries in the third world, but also countries in the first world as well. It shows to me that we are living at a time when the 1945 world order is now being attacked. We're actually, I would say, living in a domestic era, an era in which both domestic and foreign are so interwoven and complex that we cannot just govern from the international level. It cannot just govern from the domestic level. It has to be a transgovernmental, transnational kind of governance. I like the idea of having a multipolar system, but the reality is that we're living at a moment in time, which I fear is causing us to think very seriously about whether or not hegemony is an important principle to have as a governing principle. In fact, I think the global hegemonic system is collapsing before our very eyes. The United States, which is the last hegemon, last remaining hegemon, is losing its hegemony. China, which is, some people think maybe the next hegemon to replace the United States, is not interested in hegemony. Because it sees it as sort of a derogatory kind of concept. So I think we might be moving to a world which has no hegemon, and that's going to be a completely different kind of world. For any young person who's interested in diplomacy, you have to think about living in a world where hegemons don't exist any longer. So you have no choice but to actually work together in a multipolar way, in order to be a multilateral way, I should say, in order to be able to make things work. So I think diplomacy is going to be challenging for you, for any young person coming up at this stage. But I think it's a very good profession to move into, because we're living in a world where we're going to be moving from one world order to another. And the kind of new world order that we create will depend very heavily on the kind of young people and the ideas that young people have to create this new world order.
Thank you, Professor Knight, and thank you for leaving us off on a more optimistic note. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. And thank you to our audience for the great questions. I think we've been contending with a lot of issues of language, of rhetoric. We had our panels yesterday. Our closing one yesterday was on Black Lives Matter, and they spoke a lot about the importance of language, of history, of acknowledgement, and moving toward agency. And I think there's a lot to see that's very negative about this, but I'm hoping that we can see kind of ways to bring more people to the table, to really include the voices and ideas of the populations that are being affected by these things. And so I'm hoping that we can move in a more positive direction. So thank you again to everybody for joining us. And so this is the end of our first panel for today. Please join us later for our next panel on global health and racism. So thank you very much.